Eric,
Omar.
let's be clear. This is a filler episode.
All right. Setting the stage, setting expectations. I like it.
You got to set expectations low so you receive no disappointment. I brought back that joke because I actually said that for our gym environment, the original time that we recorded it, that got lost. So I had to bring it back because you got to bring it back at least one time. You got to let the people know. Got to keep them on their toes. Let them judge for themselves. Is this a monster episode, or are they just trying to be humble now by saying this is a filler episode? Or is it indeed a filler episode?
Yeah, I mean, they won't know what to expect. And people really need to be told how to appreciate a podcast episode on the front end.
Yeah.
Because, what are they going to do if they don't have, guidance from those atop the pyramid? So I think it's really our duty.
So, Eric, let's get into this for a second because there are, systems that function in much the same way. Usually there's, in quotations, a separation between the artist and the critic, but we're both the critic and the artist. So sure, you go on like Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic, and we can't be naive in assuming that these scores aren't weaponized in order to try and, sensationalize aspects of the film. So you have the trailer to whet the appetite to get individuals excited. Unfortunately, Iron Culture, we don't possess this technology at the time with Apple, iTunes. We've heard that, Spotify is diligently working on this in order to get you excited, properly excited for the episode. So we don't have that aspect. And at the same time, critics, there are many paid critics. So when you release a Marvel movie or whatever, there are certain ones that get amplified, right? When you then show the new trailer, this is a 5-star movie. Like everyone's saying, oh, guess what? You need to check out this movie. It's fantastic. And we all know it's atrocious. There's that thin line of separation. At Iron Culture, you just need the two people atop the pyramid because this is the gospel. We cut out the middleman, the middle woman. There is no one but us. So we're just telling you directly.
Yeah, you don't have to wonder, is this a biased paid critic?
Yeah.
It's the people who made the movie who told you, of course we're biased, but of course we're right. So it's this kind of, there's no question, there's no ethical conundrum. We're telling you our opinion.
Well, we simplified it.
And you have to share it.
Yeah.
So, easy.
We are biased, but we're also correct. So you're not left in this weird, I hate that amorphous feeling like, should I trust this individual? We have laid bare our claims and what, we have at risk here by saying that it's a filler or monster episode. But in fact, this is a little bit of, I think what pickup artists call negging today, I believe is what they said. I'm not sure. I think they're all in jail by now for doing wildly inappropriate things. Nonetheless, our TikTok has been simply exploding. Eric's dance moves, if you're not on our TikTok at Iron Culture, the podcast, you need to be, because it's taken the world by storm.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it's
our absolutely real TikTok account. Make sure you give it a follow. Is it a follow that you do on
a subscribe? On they go on the talk. They tick the talk.
Give us a tick. Give us a tick on the talk.
Thank you.
We'll show you our dance moves.
But we have, I wonder how many we're going to get. For some reason, I think just because of the cult, it's either we're a duo, but we also have, a leaning towards that fabled trilogy or trinity because there's us and then there's the audience. So there is that holy trifecta, so to speak. We're going to go through as many questions as we can, Eric, and we'll see how many we do. But there are a lot of high quality ones. So thank you, TikTokers. Some of them have chosen to remain anonymous with their names, and some have abbreviated their names simply to their real name, and some are their usernames. So
can I break kayfabe for a second?
Yeah.
More? We actually have like 3 real questions from real people.
Yes.
I mean, they may be whatever screen name they are.
Yeah.
It is possible in the past that sometimes some of our questions were modified, altered, changed, or perhaps not from real individuals, or we decided to make all of their names from the same region for fun. Yeah. We'll let you decide.
Yeah.
But of course, everything was done above board.
Yeah. Olga cares about periodization very much. Nonetheless, let us begin. So we have Nick. I like that. Simple name, easy to remember, Nick. And it's not Nick like a Melly. This is a question for you, and this is a relevant question, Eric. This is actually a pretty big question, and I'm not sure how long we'll take, but I think this will be the largest portion of the podcast. Nick says, in an S&C and athletic performance environment, I feel I have somewhat of a grasp of periodization and its implementation, even if at a basic level. However, when it comes to its application in hypertrophy, I feel I'm in a space where A, maybe there just isn't that much material available on it, and possibly B, there just doesn't need to be a ton of information on it. And I'm wondering, Eric, if you could there just doesn't need to be a ton of information on it. Doesn't seem to be a ton of information on it.
I think is what that should be. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. There doesn't seem to be a lot of information on it as it relates to hypertrophy. This is a very interesting question because in most aspects, we had Kylie on, we had several different individuals. We talked periodization, the foundations. We talked in the context of athletic performance, strength training. Let's talk about this, man.
No, this is a question I actually got via email, and when I got it, I was like, hey, we got to get this on the podcast. Easy thing. And by the way, I left out part of it. This is a cult listener, so shout out to you, Nick. I think they are accurate. They're correct in that there isn't that much available material on this topic, but there sort of is. So first off, if you were to just go out on the internet and find people talking about this, there are definitely people who have models of periodization for hypertrophy. Like RP is a common one that people will be familiar with, kind of like a block model. And, week to week, you see an increase in volume, and that's the variable that you're manipulating over time. And people have been talking about different models of periodization for hypertrophy for a long time. Like Fred Hatfield is the first one that comes to mind for me. And having basically different repetition ranges based upon hopefully trying to get fiber type specific hypertrophy. And you'll hear various rationales over the years of why you might periodize hypertrophy training. Sometimes it is that, hey, we want to get preferential fiber type specific hypertrophy, which will complement one another, and whole muscle growth will be larger in the long run. Another rationale you'll get, and this has been more common since Schoenfeld's work, where he's discussed different mechanisms of hypertrophy, where you might have a bias towards one of those proposed mechanisms, like a heavier tension block, if you will, a higher rep, lower rest period, quote unquote, metabolic block, if you will, or something where you're doing overloaded eccentrics, failure, long muscle length training for damage. And I am not, by the way, I'm just overviewing what people have done. I'm not saying that I agree with all of those ideas. In fact, some of them I don't agree with,
Sure.
At least as far as a periodization model. But it's definitely something that's been discussed. However, it's often discussed in a highly speculative way, which I think is largely appropriate, given we actually don't have a lot of data on this. Now, that's if you were just to kind of go into the, I would say, gray literature or online scientific-based thinking on periodization for hypertrophy. But if you were to go and become pure PubMed ninja mode, throw on the face covering, grab your shuriken, and then put it down because you need to type into the URL, you get a different kind of take. And I think it would be easy for someone with a very rigid interpretation of the hierarchy of evidence and how do we, gauge truth about a topic, to feel like, oh, we actually do have a decent amount of data on this, and indeed we can make a pretty solid conclusion. So, for example, there was a 2022 meta-analysis on periodization for the effects of strength, power, and hypertrophy, if I recall correctly, that was just published in January. And that was by Mosgaard and colleagues. That's Moesgaard. Effects of periodization on strength and muscle hypertrophy in volume-equated resistance training programs, a systematic review and meta-analysis. And that was published in Sports Medicine. So this is probably, arguably in our field, the best journal for this type of thing. It is a meta-analysis, top of the evidential hierarchy. And if you were to look at this, you'd be like, hey, at face value, periodization doesn't matter for hypertrophy. Why? Well, because they have two different, of their multiple meta-analyses, two of them were, one, they looked at periodized versus non-periodized programs and their effects on hypertrophy. And I think they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 studies, which is pretty good for our field as far as meta-analytic comparisons. And then another comparison of undulating versus linear types of periodization for hypertrophy, again with 10 studies. And in both cases, no significant difference. You see that, the forest plot, you can see the little sideways diamond crossing that zero line. Easy peasy, periodization doesn't matter. But here's the problem, Omar. And let me ask you a question. We're going to reason by analogy using the Socratic method. All right. If you told me that you had a meta-analysis where it was comparing cycling training versus swimming to see which was better for improving your run time in the marathon, and it found no significant difference, could we conclude that the type of endurance training doesn't matter for running?
No.
Exactly, because that's basically what we're looking at in this periodization meta-analysis. All of these studies that have been meta-analyzed, and the vast majority of meta-analyzed studies and studies that compare outcomes, most of them are looking at enhancing strength or power, and they measure hypertrophy. But they're programs designed to increase 1RM strength in most cases, right?
Yeah.
Or they're not, at least at the very least, they're not explicitly designed to be a periodized model for hypertrophy. Even when, the study itself is interested in enhancing hypertrophy and strength, they're using a linear or undulating model. And if we go back to, okay, where did undulating periodization come from and where did linear periodization come from? They came from models that the whole basis of their formation, the logical rationale for setting up the changes and variables from week to week, is based upon the idea of we're trying to enhance performance. So the models of periodization which we fundamentally think of in periodization terminology are not designed to enhance hypertrophy. Rather, hypertrophy is typically a mesocycle within an overall periodized model. So it's a hard question to answer if we kind of operate in the typical sports science lens. Because if we wanted to look at periodization for hypertrophy, we kind of have to wipe the slate semi-clean, not completely clean, but basically look at this one mesocycle and go, all right, well, if we were to do multiple back-to-back mesocycles of hypertrophy training, what would that look like? And could we make those be complementary in some way? So it is a very different ball game. And I think for that reason, we need a more simpler definition of what is periodization.
Okay.
So instead of thinking of it as this, periodized model where things have to change on X and Y basis, I like to use a definition of periodization that comes from the literature, just a study by Buford and colleagues in '07. Not a review. This is not the definitive terminology, but I think it's a useful definition from a utilitarian perspective because it can apply to a broader array of things, which I think is important for hypertrophy. And that definition of periodization is the planned manipulation of training variables in order to maximize training adaptations and to prevent the onset of overtraining syndrome. Pretty straightforward. And when you think about it from that lens, if you plan to change a training variable to enhance performance or prevent overtraining, that's periodized. Now, obviously, people will take issue with that. Often in the literature, and when you're looking at one of these meta-analyses or what have you, the definition of periodization is, or like what you compare as a periodized to a non-periodized program. What defines the non-periodized program is that there's no change in repetition ranges, there's no change in exercises, and the only thing that would change is potentially the load if they were able to hit failure, which is a very common thing in these programs, and go above the rep target. So let's say it's, hey, we're always doing 8 to 12 RM every exercise every single day, and next week we're going to stay in 8 to 12 RM. Oh, you got 3 sets. You got 12 on your third set still, or your first set, or whatever the protocol is. We're going to go up in load to make sure you stay in that 8 to 12 RM zone. We still need to fail in the same zone. So the load is going up. So it has progressive overload, if you will, but it's not necessarily changing in terms of those key variables. So that is the definition of periodization. You could argue that just by simply increasing load, that sort of meets the definition I gave, but I think people are getting what I'm saying. And really it's, if you change reps, which is pretty common, like if you're adding reps week to week, that's technically periodized by this definition, right? If you train the same way but take cyclical deloads, like, every 6 weeks I take a week off, or I train light, or, 3 times a year I take a deload, that's a planned manipulation of training variables to prevent, overtraining syndrome and keep adaptations going. You could argue that's an element of periodization. So this is a purposely loose definition, but I think it is helpful, and it allows us to kind of operate within the realm of hypertrophy. So anyway, I know I've covered a lot of ground there, but the key points just to start this conversation, Omar, is that we do have actually 3 meta-analyses, and the most recent one is probably the most appropriate, that Mosgaard one in 2022. We do have a lot of supposition, and if we operate within the realm of like evidence-based practice, that could make you think, we have like speculation and expert opinions, but the best quality evidence says this doesn't matter. Unfortunately, though, I would argue that the best quality evidence on this is not actually answering the target question. We're limited by what we're comparing. So we have to kind of start climbing down the pyramid and going, oh, all right, what type of controlled trials do we have? And what is the formation of some of these speculations? So I think probably what might be best to do from here, Omar, is to discuss some of the reasons why people suggest periodizing for hypertrophy and which variables they typically periodize and the rationale, and we can assess some of those claims. I don't know. Do you think that makes sense?
Eric, I think that'd be fantastic. Very quickly, I just want to say, I think potentially also why people might struggle with the concept of periodization as it relates to hypertrophy, just as a concept, is that typically people envision a periodization always having an end goal, either athletic performance. So you have a meet day, you have a competition for strength and power performance, you're a powerlifter. What is the theoretical one for hypertrophy if you don't have that, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? Oh, you're doing a show. You're not doing a show. Well, wait a second there. And then also, just really quick, Eric, just to throw it back to you, that's an interesting definition to operate on, the 2007 one, because by its very framework, admittedly, what people would call a program then, which features the manipulation of rep ranges and other variables, would be periodization. But I think the other implication, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe from Nick or other people, with it, periodization, there's different cycles and different lengths of time. But the implication to me versus what people would call a program would be the time course, in that a program is 8 weeks or 10 weeks when they talk about it. And if they're talking about periodization, it's the length of time.
You're all over it, man. Yeah, and it's implicit in the word periodization, right? Yeah. Now, I think that was extremely astute, and that's actually something we should talk about briefly. And I will acknowledge, like, if Mike Stone was right here, he'd be like, I don't agree with your definition of periodization. Like, there needs to be planned phases, so there are periods of time, and it will result in a peak in performance, right? So I think you just can't have that when you're talking about periodizing for hypertrophy, because you're not trying to peak hypertrophy. It's a continual adaptation, right? So it is something that you're like, hypertrophy is one of the various mechanisms by which strength occurs, So that is why it is often part of a periodized plan that is trying to improve force production. So what we're honing in on this one specific non-performance adaptation, which is really a structural adaptation to training, if you will, that is the consequence of our body trying to accomplish a couple things, having more ability to complete work and produce more force. Now we can't have that same framework, if you will. So the distinction between programming and periodization when we're talking about hypertrophy, and I have to give a big shout out to Dr. Zerdo. So in my opinion, it's like his school of thought and his mentoring is where a lot of this comes from. He's the one I first saw use that Buford definition, and I was like, that's great. I'm gonna keep using that. I like that. And also, you'll notice that even though he's considered like the godfather of DUP, he will often call DUP, instead of daily undulating periodization, he'll call it daily undulating programming. And that is specifically for the reason you brought up, is DUP is defined, its defining characteristics is the differences in rep ranges between days. So it's actually about the microcycle, right? So yeah, you could say that programming is any time you're talking about within or microcycle to microcycle changes. Here's an 8-week program. What is that? Is that it's 1 or 2 mesocycles at most, right? You might write a program that has like a volume phase, an intensity phase, and a peaking phase. So it's like real truncated block periodization. But for the most part, when you're talking about these programs, they are relatively homogeneous throughout with small changes. Maybe a slight change if it is like a peaking program, if you will. So yeah, I would say that is, you could absolutely characterize what we're talking about as programming. And I think it is also fair to say that programming and periodization for hypertrophy are probably pretty similar. And you might, once we go through all the evidence, never need to actually consider big picture periodization for hypertrophy. It would just be programming in a logical way. But maybe not. Ultimately, we don't have a ton of data. So that's a really great point. Big shout out to Zerdos. And yeah, I would say the distinction between periodization and programming is simply the time course, right? So that's a very important point, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's something that I think is critical to this conversation, to make sure we're all on the same page with terminology. So like I said, if there's some people who are S&Cs or students of periodization and they don't agree with kind of the framework I'm setting up, I like all good for stuff other than just periodizing hypertrophy. So we're on the same page, and I'm just proposing one model for what this might look like if you were going to periodize someone whose only goal was hypertrophy, right? Then it just becomes, well, what are the ways which I would manipulate variables long term, if we're talking about periodization, that would complement one another and theoretically get me the most muscle growth? Cool. So like I said, if we talk about the different rationales for this, the oldest one and the most common one that I'm familiar with is trying to get different fiber type hypertrophy, right? So like going back to Fred Hatfield kind of deal. So, heavy or light to try to get, more slow twitch or fast twitch fiber growth. And that idea, it's kind of waxed and waned in terms of its popularity. And I think there are some potential physiological errors with the thinking behind it. So if we just kind of go back to basic physiology, a really important understanding is Henneman's size principle. And that is basically that we have a mixture of fibers, and they exist on a spectrum in every single muscle group. Broadly, you can classify them as slow twitch or fast twitch. Fast twitch are less energy efficient, but they can contract faster. They're generally larger, and they produce more power, but not necessarily more force per unit of cross-sectional area. Those are often thought of as like your strength and power type fibers. If you look at a Olympic lifter, you compare them to an endurance athlete, you'll see a greater preponderance of type 2 versus type 1, and the opposite in the endurance athlete. Type 1 fibers, generally smaller in cross-sectional area. They are more oxidative in nature. They can sustain contractions for longer, but they're slower to contract, and they're basically more fatigue resistant. Okay. So anyway, the idea is that, well, if you train more for endurance, which is true, you will get more, shifts towards a type 1 fiber. And if you train more for strength, you'll get shift towards the other one. And that is 100% true. However, in the context of like resistance training, not comparing an endurance athlete to a weightlifter, the differences start to get a little smaller, and we have to question whether they matter for hypertrophy. And here's why. So Henneman's size principle. If I train with heavy weights, let's say I do a 6 RM, it's not only training my fast twitch fibers. Henneman's size principle states that we increase motor unit recruitment to the demands of the task. So if we have a high force output requirement, yes, we do recruit fast twitch fibers. We recruit those high threshold motor units, but we also recruit everything lower than it because they get recruited in order, which is part of Henneman's size principle. So meaning if you're lifting a 1 RM, everything's turned on, right? Assuming you have basic motor proficiency. However, on the flip side, if you are picking up a pencil, you're probably only recruiting mostly those low threshold motor units that innervate those slow twitch fibers, right? However, if you were to pick up that pencil to failure, right, which is a hard thing to think of, but let's say you grab, 40 or 50% of your 1 RM on curls and go all the way to failure, you eventually will recruit either cyclically, we're not sure, or just kind of in a slow rise, but probably through motor unit cycling and things come in and out as other fibers fatigue. You recruit all those high threshold motor units because other fibers are fatiguing and falling out. And eventually at the point when you're close to failure, everything has been given a pretty big stimulus and there's a large fatigue effect. And we can see this both through motor unit behavior studies, but also through all of the applied studies where we see that similar hypertrophy occurs when you have volume matched, regardless of whether you're doing high rep or low rep training, so long as it is not way too low load, like below 30 or 40% of 1 RM. And then maybe it's a little more like actually endurance training. So anyway, if the Henneman size principle kind of breaks down our idea here of maybe we should try to train heavy and light to get different fiber growth, because one thing that all bodybuilders do, they train reasonably close to failure. And if you're training reasonably close to failure, you're basically getting to that same point where you're at, 80% of 1 RM-ish, because how many reps can you do with 80%? I don't know, 8. And that's the lowest RIR you could be is at 7 when you first do the first rep, right? So you're already starting pretty close to the end of that tunnel. It means you're already having high fiber recruitment, whether you got there from starting at 80% of 1 RM, or if you started at 40% of 1 RM and did 30 reps to get to that point where you can only do another 7 or 8 reps, right? So nonetheless, so it kind of goes, well, does this matter? If we're training with the requisite effort, aren't we going to get to the same place? And if you take that understanding, there is a questionable role of this fiber type specific hypertrophy, but we don't need to speculate. We actually do have data on this. So there was a 20, I believe it was 2020. I can't remember the specific. Yeah, 2020. Gurgic, the man who does all the meta-analyses, even Omar, you recognize the name.
Yeah.
He did a meta-analysis, the effects of low load versus high load resistance training on muscle fiber hypertrophy, a meta-analysis published in the Journal of Human Kinetics. And it basically found this. It looked at studies on low load training and high load training and looking at slow twitch and fast twitch fiber growth. And overall, there was no significant effect. There was slightly almost an effect, I believe, for type 2 fibers. However, it was largely driven by one study. And if you remove that study, the effect went away. And more importantly, though, before we just go, nope, this is not a thing, meta-analysis, same lesson from before from Mosgard, we have to make sure that we have high quality data to be analyzing. Gurgic's conclusion was not this doesn't matter. It was, hey, we have really wide confidence intervals. We need more data. We don't have enough. And there was actually only 5 studies meta-analyzed, which is good. Don't get me wrong. 5 studies on a topic is great. But it's not enough when each one of these studies has really wide ranges, and we can't get a reasonable estimation of the population effect, even from meta-analyzing these 5 studies. So it's still up in the air, is kind of what we're seeing here. But interestingly enough, in both meta-analyses of looking at both type 1 and type 2 growth, both seem to favor high loads. So it doesn't follow the pattern we expected. Now, that would be relatively simple. We can go, okay, we need a little more data, but it's not looking good, and leave it there, and we move forward to the next thing. But interestingly enough, there's a group in Russia that has done research on this topic, and essentially their findings line up perfectly with the hypothesis that low load would preferentially hypertrophy type 1 fibers, and high load would preferentially recruit type 2 fibers, and you get a training effect from that. There's Netreba 2013 and Vinogradova 2013, where you can actually find the translated full text on ResearchGate, and you can take a look at like table 1 from Vinogradova, and you can look at figure 4 from Netreba, and you can see these like really clear differences. Now, it is a little unclear when you read these texts because the translation isn't perfect, whether the only variable changed between these groups was load, or whether there were differences in proximity to failure, set structure. Sometimes there were like supersets and multiple clusters, and rest periods, and there were some slight differences there. But at least if you look at these studies, and there was one prior to that by Netreba in like 2007, but I could only find the abstract. So like if you just take the abstract's word for it, you've got like these 3 studies, and then you have these 5 studies, and they find conflicting things. Either it doesn't make a difference, or it follows a very predictable pattern and could be related to other variables changing, but the proof of principle is kind of still a question mark in my opinion. I would like to see this replicated, Omar, because the thing is that these are all from the same researchers. And so it could be something related to the way they're conducting the studies, the participants they're using, the way they do their analysis, like counting fiber type. And like fiber typing is something I haven't done personally, but when I read about it, the methods have changed over time, and there is some subjectivity depending on the methods you use. So nonetheless, there's still a question mark on fiber type specific growth, but I don't think it's going to be a large effect. And I think, if anything, the only thing that logically can make sense to me is that, yeah, heavy training recruits those slow twitch fibers, but because they're fatigue resistant, like a set of 6 or 8 is not going to have a large training effect on them. Does that make sense to you? Why there could still be an argument for this? Yeah. And that is actually supported by one really interesting study. This one is not from the same group. It's not from the Russian group, and it's not published in Russian journals. Not that I'm saying if it's published in Russia, it doesn't count. This isn't the Cold War. I'm just saying it's because it's all from the same group, and I don't have a great translation. It's hard to really evaluate it. But there was a study published in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise in 2019 by Bjornson and colleagues. This is a group in Norway, and I think we might have talked about this on the podcast before, but it was a really, really intriguing study, and I still think it's wild. And it's titled Type 1 Muscle Fiber Hypertrophy After Blood Flow Restriction Training in Powerlifters. Is this one ringing a bell?
I think so. Go on.
Yeah, so it's wild. First off, it's on members of the Norwegian powerlifting team. So right. some strong-ass dudes training 5 days a week, okay? And specifically, what's wild about this is it's only a 6.5-week study, okay? And the 2 groups were actually quite similar, except for one minor difference in terms of what they did. You're going to recall this because it's what Jeff Nippard made you do. The 4 sets to failure with BFR front squats at 30% of 1RM.
Love it.
Yeah. So if you're getting a little bit of PTSD hearing about this protocol, I understand it.
Definitely.
Yeah. But so 6.5 weeks. Everyone's training 5 days a week. The standard training, which they gave some details regarding the Norwegian powerlifting teams, like protocol, they're squatting on most days, and it is 60 to 85% of 1RM. They are using variations of the main lifts, but they're typically training with like 1 to 7 reps, right? So it's sub-maximal. I wouldn't say like Shaiko-esque, but it's like your typical periodized sub-maximal with decent variation themes on the main lifts with a little bit of accessory work, right? But in week 1 and week 3, and no other week, okay, out of these 6 weeks, the BFR group, instead of doing their squat variation, they did those BFR squats. They loaded up 30% of their front squat 1RM, blood flow restriction, so they're putting cuffs around their upper thigh, and they went to failure on the first set, and then they did a second set for 15 reps, a third set for 12 reps, and then went to failure on the fourth set. So that's terrible. This is front squats. So not only is it squats with BFR and failure, which is already hard, but it's choking you. As you know, Omar, it's an awful, awful thing. And just to give you an idea of how many reps they got, on average in that first set to failure, they're getting 30 reps. And then on the fourth set where they took to failure also, they only got 8 reps, which tells you the kind of fatigue that you saw across these 4 sets when you're only getting a quarter of the reps on that fourth set. So here's what's wild. This is a relatively minor difference between these two groups in the grand scheme of things, right? That means week 2, 4, 5, and 6 were identical between these groups. And they looked at muscle biopsies pre and post and ultrasound measures of changes in hypertrophy. The traditional training group didn't see any significant changes in fiber type specific growth or overall hypertrophy, meaning they did not have a pre to post change in hypertrophy. And you're like, oh, this program didn't work. Like, no, it's 6.5 weeks in the Norwegian powerlifting team, and they're not training for hypertrophy, they're training for strength. Should we have expected a change? So that's a really important point. However, for the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, and I think the vastus intermedius, I think for actually all heads of the quadricep, there was either a pre to post significant difference, a greater amount of growth compared to the other group, or both in all heads. And specifically the rectus femoris and vastus lateralis were significant pre to post and greater than the other group. So not only did they grow more, but interestingly enough, they did not see a significant increase in type 2 fast twitch fiber growth, but they did see a significant increase in type 1 fiber growth. So this difference between groups and having greater quad growth in the BFR group was almost entirely driven by type 1 specific fiber hypertrophy. So this is basically a proof of concept saying you can do this. This does exist. Like if you take a specific population that has trained submaximally, not doing stuff that really challenges their type 1 fibers, and like powerlifters, right? So a pretty extreme endurance-based training cohort, and then you give them a very extreme high rep protocol, maybe we can see this. Do I think these same results will be replicated in most bodybuilders? Probably not. How relevant is this? I don't know. But the point is like that one bit of speculation I had as to how there could be this fiber type specific effect, at least towards type 1 fibers, it's there. The question, though, is, well, if we'd looked at a group of bodybuilders who their average reps per set were, let's say, 10 over their training career, would we see such an extreme difference when we're comparing people whose average reps per set are like 4, over their training career? I don't know, especially considering one group probably trains to failure a lot more, has more exercises they're doing, does accessory work. Oh, they don't do accessory work. All of their stuff is kind of accessory work, if you will, as a bodybuilder versus a powerlifter. This may not be relevant, but I think it's worth, keeping watch this space on the whole fiber type specific hypertrophy discussion.
Eric, powerlifters and their damn singles. When is it going to end?
No time soon. I mean, considering I've promoted powerlifters doing singles, but honestly, the real question for that study, if we want to talk about powerlifters, is that's great, but did it help them increase their 1RM?
Sure. Yeah. Now, it's funny, Eric. As soon as you said Norwegian, I was thinking about the study on frequency. And then when you brought up BFR, I'm like, it's ringing a little bit of a bell. As soon as you said then, obviously Jeff Nippard, I remembered immediately. But all you had to say is BFR Omar front squats, and boom, I'm right back in, right back in the Cold War. Like I don't know what's going on. I'm gonna need not weeks, not months, years of therapy to get over it. But that does pose a very interesting question, because when you were just talking before this about the manipulation of different variables, and then going through rep ranges and why a one potentially should do that. I like how you framed it, just in the sense, because I think two of the most interesting things, this is very interesting, but the second thing was when you brought up that study where it was the same individual, one leg would train one style and then one leg would train another style, and you'd see widely different results. I think it's, at least in I don't want to say in the powerlifting space, but there has been a reductionist take that essentially that's contrary to basically what you're discussing. I'm not saying it's right in the slightest, but just where you lose fidelity of information when you reduce things down past their essential parts. I would say that the argument they would give is, if you're doing, the fundamental movements, if you're training in lower rep ranges, you are recruiting, of course, type 2 muscle fibers, but the more slow twitch ones also, because according to that, it has to be, in sequence or whatnot. And just this very notion that perhaps the type 1 muscle fibers aren't indeed being fatigued, and there could be a rationale, especially in people that have largely lived their entire training existence at like 5 or less, like maybe 2 to 3 sets of 8 or 10, would be very interesting. If it was true.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the counter argument there is, well, what about the opportunity cost? Like I could spend the time doing those high rep sets, doing more work on training heavy, which would have maybe not the same effects on type 1 fiber hypertrophy, but more specific strength adaptations, which is what I care about. And I think the study I just cited is the counter argument to that. Like, it only took 2 out of 6 weeks of replacing the squat movement with this.
Yep.
So that's 1/3 of your training in this study, and showing massive, like, because you think about it, if you're detrained to something or it's a novel stimulus to you, it doesn't require much to get this novel adaptation. And as we saw in the other group, what did they get out of not doing it? Nothing over 6.5 weeks, right? That wasn't a sufficient amount of time. So you're chipping away at getting these incremental progressions over multiple months when you're a high level powerlifter. So the question of the opportunity cost is really saying, okay, I'm training 5 days a week, I'm squatting. The thing that's really going to make my squat blow up is a 6-day a week of squatting. Like, I don't think so. Like, that's probably not it, So when you're already pushing all the chips forward into specificity, you have to go, okay, well, is the 1% I lose from taking one chip away that is worth like 10% if I put that same amount of time into something else worth it? And then even more so, if we want to talk about periodization, if I do that in an intelligent way, further from competition where that 1% is actually less relevant, can I get a benefit? And that's the whole logical rationale behind periodization for performance. But anyway, talking about periodization for hypertrophy, I kind of walked through the timeline. We started with Fred Hatfield as kind of the avatar I used for fiber type specific hypertrophy. Although you'll still hear that discussion, like you often hear like Mike Israetel talk about this and stuff like that. And I think the overall take home here is we don't know. There's not great data. I don't think it's going to be like a huge benefit. But ultimately, if we're talking about periodization for hypertrophy, that's constantly only training specifically for hypertrophy. We're talking to an audience who's willing to optimize things a little bit here, right? So that's okay, right? I'm not going to make the fallacy of saying that the extra 5% gains you can get don't matter, because they do matter to people who would consider periodization for hypertrophy, right? Then the next kind of avatar I used was Brad Schoenfeld, right? Who, and I don't know that I would say he is the main avatar for the periodization model based upon the mechanisms. But I think a lot of people have tried to take, some of the theoretical underpinnings of our current, construct of how hypertrophy occurs, and then apply training to them. Like, I need to do high rep, pump style training for the metabolic effects. I need to train like a power lifter for the tension effects. And then I need to, enhance damage for that side of it. Overall, I would say the mechanisms are not always necessarily like directly tacked on to application. describing how something works doesn't mean that you necessarily don't get it from just one type of training. Like, I think that there's some missing logic there, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too deeply, but it's basically another rationale for training in different rep ranges and loading zones. So high load and low load training, one rationale from Hatfield, that's great for fiber type specific hypertrophy. From other camps, maybe we want to have complementary mechanisms. Like it still just produces similar homogeneous whole muscle growth, training to failure in low loads or training to failure in high loads. But maybe, if we do both, we can use different signaling mechanisms, different pathways, if you will, to stimulating hypertrophy that'll be complementary, that would be more efficient. Because maybe, one type of training you get too adapted to it and you get quote unquote resistant to that way of inducing growth, right? So maybe we want to vary between these rep ranges. So again, when we look at the signaling data, so like, and up front, I'm not an expert on anabolic signaling. Like there are and then we're still learning it, basically ways of stimulating mTOR or the various other pathways that you can suppress or stimulate either downstream or immediately mTOR and get muscle protein synthesis higher. That's fantastic. Not my area. I am just going to refer some studies that you can read in depth. But there's one study by Hahn and colleagues. We reviewed this in mass in like our first, I think our first issue. Yeah. Or maybe no, our first volume. I can't remember which issue. But anyway, molecular, neuromuscular, and recovery responses to light versus heavy resistance training in young men. And they took 80% of 1RM training to failure versus 30% of 1RM training to failure. And they looked at acute cellular responses. Very similar. We didn't see any difference in the actual signaling pathways. Specifically, they looked at P70S6K, and that did not seem to be different between the training styles. Notably, that's not the only signaling pathway one can look at, but at least in this study, that didn't seem to be different. And we also didn't see any difference in the mRNA coding for type 1, 2A, or 2X fibers. So again, that's kind of a little more evidence that would suggest, hey, maybe there's not a big effect for at least fiber type specific hypertrophy. And if Hahn and colleagues' study was the only one, then maybe we could put a pin in that, although we wouldn't want to conclude based upon one study. But there's other research. And again, unfortunately, it comes from the same singular research group, the one in Russia. So there's a study that came out, I believe, in 2019. I could be wrong, by Lysenko and colleagues. And that was signaling responses to high and moderate load strength training and resistance trained muscle. I stated that wrong. Signaling responses to high and moderate load strength exercise and trained muscle. It's definitely one of those titles not written by a native English speaker. But they compared 65% of 1RM versus 85% of 1RM in leg press to failure. And interestingly enough, they actually found different signaling responses that got eventually to hypertrophy. They didn't look at all of the same pathways. They looked at different pathways than Hahn. So we kind of have this basic conclusion now of, well, is there divergent signaling? Like, is there different pathways to get to the same place of hypertrophy from training in different loading zones? And the answer is like, maybe. But I think, again, I would really like to see other labs replicate this. I've seen a couple of studies from this group. I think there was one in 2015, and then I think this one in 2019. And they both found similar things that, hey, you do low reps, you do high reps, it seems to get you to a different place in terms of the actual anabolic signaling. So maybe there is something to this, even if it doesn't result in fiber type specific hypertrophy. You could make a rationale from like a mechanistic argument.
Eric, hold up here for a sec, just really quick. If the studies haven't been replicated thus far, and you said this is from the same group in Russia that also had a slightly divergent results in another series of things that they were testing, how before, because I think what some people don't understand, and you've really explained this over the years with iron cultures, that it takes time to if you want to replicate these studies, we're a year out, 2 years out, it will take a while. So if you had to assess the current information, and let's say how would one even try and assess the validity, because there's a language barrier here, and these aren't accusations, I'm just saying that, it's interesting that in both instances there were slightly different findings. How, when taking obviously a look at the methodology, but then also I guess like the translation, do you assess it where you go, okay, you know, they said they did it this way. We have to believe how they're laying it out is exactly how they did it, even though in one of the episodes that we did that you covered, that of course there's a little bit of wiggle room. Not that anything's tampered with at all,
Sure.
but just with the way that it's being described isn't necessarily even an accurate representation of what they're doing. You gave the great example in one of the episodes about training to failure and what does that actually entail? What's the environment like? Is it homogenous the whole time? Like, are people every single time they do a top set, are the same people yelling, or the same cues? Like, all these things do influence the outcome. So how, if this is what we got and we're speculating, and it's interesting if it's true, when you're taking a look at it, man, like what are you trying to look at in order to say, like, yeah, like, you know what, this does seem plausible based upon what they've outlined and also a variety of other factors?
That's a great question. And, you know, the difference between the 2015 and the 2019 anabolic signaling studies that came out of this lab group and the ones that I mentioned earlier that were from 2013 is the 2013 papers that are on fiber type specific hypertrophy, where I was like, you know, the translation's kind of rough. They were in Russian journals that had been translated to English. And it's difficult, I'm not going to lie, to fully be confident in what, like, okay, they're saying leg extension and leg press here, but do they mean leg extension, leg press? Yeah. They're talking about like constant tension reps. It seems like multiple variables are changing. But the 2015 and the 2019 paper, like the 2019 paper specifically was published in Physiological Reports, and the English is really good. So something that this lab group did in the last 6 or 7 years, they got more savvy at translating and communicating what they were doing, and they're publishing in English language journals. So like when you read the study in Physiological Reports, it's pretty clear what they did. And like, I'm not confused reading it. It makes sense. But like you said, even like the example I gave with training to failure, you know, one lab group finds training to failure versus not seems to make a difference. Another one doesn't. You come to find out that one is using volitional failure and maybe the other one is using momentary failure, which is we actually need to see them fail a rep versus the person decides when they can no longer do more reps. So it might be comparing an 8 to 11 RPE, you know? So anyway, while that doesn't necessarily fix the issue of going, is this a specific thing related to the population they're studying or the way they specifically implement low load or moderate load in this case versus high load training, it does at least make it clear that I'm not making an error in communicating the study. Like I can read this and it's been relatively clear. So that's a partial answer. I think also in the world of signaling, there is a little more research. I haven't dug into it a whole bunch because it's not a lot of applied stuff, but I don't think, and don't quote me on this, that this specific group is the only study that has showed that there may be different signaling effects of different types of training. The question really is, though, does that matter? You know, like it is a bit of a speculative statement to go, well, if you just keep using one signaling pathway, it'll become resistant. Like that's just a thing that happens. Or even if it doesn't, that if you have multiple pathways, that it'll be complementary in some way rather than just redundant or a similar outcome. And I don't think, I just don't think we know that, but it is at least interesting to say that there might be multiple roads to Rome, which perhaps we should saturate both. I don't know. I think that's like a decent rationale at the very least.
Eric, it's so funny because when you read the title did sound a little janky. And what actually spurred me to ask that question, totally unrelated, but damn it, I'm going to mention it. I recently beat that game, Elden Ring. It's a fantastic game. But there's an issue right now because it's an open world, but the way the story is told with the lore where you discover it, it's open to a lot of interpretation. However, the Japanese original, so it's a Japanese director, and then the English translation, when they're trying to decipher some of the nuanced detail, there's now huge debates about just a few intricate parts that in the Japanese, if one translates, if you get someone to translate from the Japanese to English and then what the final English version is, there is a difference, and this has sparked actually one trying to figure out like the real bones of some of the story, what it's like. And I couldn't, when you mentioned the previous one about it being translated and it being hard to read, it's like, well, wait a second here, you know, like even when you said about is this a leg press or a leg extension, I felt it had to be asked.
Well, a funny thing, having peer reviewed, God, probably close to 100 papers now. When you are a peer reviewer, the main thing that you're focusing on is the actual body of the paper. So where you're more likely to leave errors or odd grammar is actually the title.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is a funny thing that you will see in research is you'll find sometimes a really well written paper by someone by a group that is not English as a first language, but the title is still a little janky.
Yep.
And this is on top of the fact that this is scientific writing, so the titles start janky and unnecessarily long, and it's always like the blank effect on blank in this thing in this population, and like the grammar is always terrible. And anyway, so it's titles are often leaving something to be desired.
Eric, now I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole because guess what? This has basically become the episode all about periodization for hypertrophy, which I'm loving. Let's cycle then back because we're trying to give a rationale for, plausible explanations for a few different things one should consider. Let's go back to the concept of periodization for hypertrophy, or what I think Chris was asking the question where he said,
Nick.
Nick, I'm sorry.
This is a real person. We can't just change the name every time we say it.
Hey, and as we said, some of my favorite real people are fictional characters that I read. So let me just say, what is reality? Nonetheless, so Nick wants to know the concept of periodization as it relates to hypertrophy. If we then zoom back out, can we then realign?
So you're basically saying, Eric, answer the damn question.
No. I am loving this, but just we've been going down some avenues, and why is like, okay, why in the first place? Well, let's take a look. What's the current available evidence that we have? Talk to me now. Let's bring it back for Nick. Not a summary at all, but just getting back to that question of what he needs to be aware of.
Absolutely. So I think where I've left you now is that there may be a rationale to train with different rep ranges from the two traditionally proposed reasons.
Yeah.
But I would say you don't even need to go that deep into physiology to have a reason to do this. And some of this is really intuitive. If you train heavy all the time, I'm happy to speculate that you're probably at a higher risk of injury.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's a certain type of burnout that comes with that type of training. Likewise, if you're doing really high rep training all the time, you're going to want to throw up if you're using compound lower body movements. It is also very, very taxing, especially if you're going anywhere near to failure. And that is quite challenging. And we've got data on this that I think supports that position. It's not just my speculation. Like there's a couple of different reviews of all the studies on injury frequency. So for example, if you check out Keogh and Winwood's review where they look at all this, the bodybuilding number of injuries per 1,000 hours of training, the highest is 1 per 1,000 hours. However, the highest in powerlifting is 5.8 injuries per 1,000 hours, and the lowest is 1. So like even if you took the most overrepresented injury in injuries in bodybuilders and the lowest representative one in powerlifters, they're similar. But if we take like the average, it's 2 to 3 or maybe 4 or 5 times as injurious to be a competitive powerlifter versus a competitive bodybuilder. Now, granted, there's multiple things at play here. It's not like bodybuilders and powerlifters, the only difference between them is the load they're using. There's also difference in exercises. But I think it's fair to say that most powerlifters, while yes, they primarily do the squat, bench, and deadlift, also do variations in accessory work. And it's also fair to say that most bodybuilders do variations of horizontal pressing, a hip hinge, and a squat pattern.
Yeah.
So there's a fair amount of crossover, but I would say at least some of the difference in injury rates are probably driven by load. So you probably don't want to just only train heavy all the time. And like I said, it sucks to go high rep. We actually have data quantifying this. So Ribeiro and colleagues in 2019, they looked at session RPE, session discomfort, and affect. So they had a 1 to 10 scale for session RPE, a 1 to 10 scale for discomfort, and then the feeling scale goes from -5 to +5, which is basically like, did you feel good or bad following the session? And when you look at the light load training, which was like 25 to 30 RM on everything, if I recall correctly, the session RPE was 6.4, which, by the way, on the session RPE scale, 5 is considered hard. So it's pretty high RPE. An 8.7 discomfort out of 10, and a -2.3, so they felt bad. While the moderate load, 8 to 12, was a 5.5 RPE, a 6.7 discomfort, and a 1.2 on the feeling scale. So you do the same amount of sets on the same exercises, but you just train high rep versus low rep, it feels like shit. so you don't want to do that all the time either. I think so. That in and of itself is a rationale to why you don't want to be on the extremes. But then the question is, well, can I just do like 8 to 12 or 6 to 12 or 6 to 15 all the time? And for that, I think ultimately we just have to look at studies where that was compared. And to be upfront and like kind of hardline statistical comparisons, in none of the studies that I'm aware of is there a significant difference between groups when you compare either like a block style or a daily undulating style or just a non-periodized style of training in a broader range of reps or a narrow range of reps just hanging out in like the 8 to 12 rep range. However, all the studies I'm aware of on this lean towards it being slightly better for training across rep ranges. And I think we can only expect a small effect here. So real briefly, there's the study that was cited a lot like in the last 2 years by our Carvalho and colleagues, where this basically like the meme interpretation of this online was that you need to do a strength phase before your hypertrophy phase because that results in better growth. And it's probably because you can use heavier loads and therefore produce more volume during the hypertrophy phase. I don't think that's a great interpretation of the study. Actually, what they did was it's an 8-week study, but for both groups, the group that did 8 weeks of 8 to 12 RM training, hypertrophy, or the group that did 3 weeks of strength and 5 weeks of hypertrophy training, both groups started with a 3-week lead-in of doing hypertrophy training to like make them the same when they started the study. So it's really like an 11-week protocol with strength in the middle, right? So 3 weeks hypertrophy, 5 weeks strength, and then 3 weeks strength, 5 weeks hypertrophy, got slightly better gains than the other group. And if you look at the published paper, they report this as a significant difference. Dr. Zerdos reviewed this in the 2020 issue of Mass, couldn't replicate the p-values, so he did it on his own and found that it didn't quite reach significance. And the differences between groups, it's pretty small. It's not nothing, but it's like borderline significant, borderline meaningful. But it leans in favor of having these interspersed blocks of strength and hypertrophy training, right? So there's that. That's interesting, right? There's also one that Schoenfeld did back in the day looking at DUP. This was in 2016. They had a group, the two trained groups, which is cool, trained resistance trained men. And one, every single day they trained, 3 days per week, 8 to 12 RM. The other group, every single week, this is like daily undulating programming, they had a day where they did 8 to 12, but another day where they did 25 to 30 RM, and another day where they did like 2 to 4 RM. So they had daily undulating periodization that just changed by like big differences in the repetition maximum they were training to. And again, no significant differences between groups, but for a few of the hypertrophy measurements, you were looking at like a borderline large effect in one group and a borderline moderate effect that was small in the other. And it favored the varied group with more rep ranges. So again, kind of leaning in favor. And then finally, we have Dos Santos in 2019, where they did this in a non-periodized, traditional fashion, if you use the traditional interpretation, where every day it was a reverse pyramid. One group went 12 RM, 10 RM, 8 RM on all exercises, right? So just stepping up in load and down in reps. The other group went 15, 10, 5. So both of them did reverse pyramid, every exercise, every day, matched number of sets, except one group had a broader range from 5 to 15 versus the other one, which had that traditional 8 to 12 range. And in the 5 to 15 group, you saw almost significant effects favoring the 5 to 15 group and like almost twice the percentage change in hypertrophy. So these all lean the same direction, and it doesn't seem to matter whether you're doing it block periodized, daily undulating, or non-periodized, if you will. But I think the take home here is you probably might benefit, at least in the long run, from not just having a narrow repetition range that you train in, but you don't necessarily have to periodize it. It could just be programming differences. Of course, when you start implementing things like deloads, et cetera, you're going to have elements of periodization. So the only confident thing I can say is that you should probably train across the spectrum of rep ranges for practical reasons. Don't stay really high rep or really, really low rep all the time. And for potentially outcome reasons of just, gaining more muscle, you don't want to stay just in that specific hypertrophy rep range. But whether you want to vary that within session, like you do low reps on squats, high reps on leg extensions, something in between on leg press, or whether you want to vary that between days, or whether you want to have a block of moderate rep training and then low rep training, the research would suggest that all of those can work better than just staying in a narrower range. And so you can, there's a lot of pathways to Rome. It may be that one of these systems could be better than another, but we don't have the data to support that. And, I've kind of covered pretty much everything I'm aware of on this topic. And I would say that anytime you come across someone being very definitive or very specific in nature of the way you should periodize for hypertrophy, just know that that specificity doesn't match the specific understanding that we have on this topic. And any confidence they have doesn't match the confidence of the data. So those are my two caveats in the final take home.
No, Eric, extremely powerful. This is the episode all about hypertrophy and periodization. I think this should be it. Interesting enough, I'm going to pull a Mark Ripito on you being Mike Teixeira, where he said, so what you're saying is it averages out to about 5, but I'm the hypertrophy Ripito. Because you said, so they did 15, they did a reverse pyramid, 15, 10, and 5. So what you're saying, Eric,
10.
It averages out to 10. And I'm going to assume 3 by 10. Wow. Boom. No, and then the other thing I want to say, the other shit post comment I wanted to say is that if we really looked at how they're measuring injuries as it relates to bodybuilders, it's even lower if we narrow the definition of injuries, because for bodybuilders included the injury of the ego, which is the one that they were never swole enough. Once you eliminate that one, bodybuilding is basically the safest thing you can do. There were no injuries.
You're constantly injured if we include that definition. So that's a tough one. Yeah, I think this I really went a little deeper than I initially intended.
That's good, man.
It's good.
Yeah.
And we've got, I think, maybe time for 2 other questions. But yeah, big summary for this, Nick, is that we probably need some variation. We inherently need more exercises. Also, this is another thing. I only talked about periodizing repetition range.
Yep.
There are other variables, right?
Yeah.
And we've talked about exercise selection for hypertrophy, so I encourage you to listen to that episode, or those episodes, I should say, because you could also make a solid argument for periodizing, or at least varying your exercises block to block, because it's kind of challenging to include everything you need in the same block, given that we have biarticular muscles, specific muscle heads which only do certain actions, and certain muscle heads which respond better to certain angles of training. So if you try to do it all, you might be packing too much in from a motor learning perspective, or time cost, or recovery cost. So it might make sense to have a rotation, if you will, for exercise selection on top of, finding some system to train across a variety of rep ranges.
Eric, yeah, we'll blitz these 2 questions, because it's the main course where it's do we even need dessert? Do we ?
We're just feeding the people the extra,
Yeah.
So that's okay. And I think it's time for you to start talking, Omar, because I realized from our last episode that we did on training environment, we specifically had a question that I think you got from your Instagram about what we would get for our home gym.
Yeah.
And you said, hey, since you already have your home gym, you've had it for a while, what do you primarily recommend? And then we just moved on. I don't think you ever got to answer, which you're in a fun phase right now because you're about to have a home gym. So I know you've put a lot of thought into this. So for you, someone who's a little more focused on strength, because I gave hypertrophy answers, what would be your go-to purchases for your home gym?
A Bowflex. That's pretty much all you need, folks. You could do it's the universal machine. You could do every single variation if you think about it. No.
You just got Bowflex sued by Universal, because it can't be a universal machine unless it's a universal TM machine.
This is where the scientist in the recent, what is it, not King Kong versus Godzilla, but where he gets both of them, the 2 warring factions, to finally face off. I will say, I'm going to answer this briefly, honestly, because I think, we're not Stronger by Science, where they've lowered their run time to just 60 minutes so they could, try and, it was real sad too, even in the previous episode where it was A2 Brute, where it's even you are going to betray us. It's almost like Harvey, Two-Face used to be called Harvey Dent. Macro Factor guy used to be called Eric Trexler. And when you mentioned him in a previous, it made me shed a tear. It's like the fall from grace of how he was so powerful with the things they mentioned. I mentioned that because, of course, they only do 60 minutes to promote Macro Factor as many times as possible. We're not going to do that. We'll do a solid like 75 or 80 minutes. I'll answer this question as quickly as possible, though, because I think the NSAID question is very interesting. I'm in the honeymoon.
I just want to point out the irony of saying I'm going to answer this as quickly as possible and having a 3-minute bit lead in to then answer the question. But you go ahead. No, I don't want to slow us down anymore.
The answer is going to be a minute long. The lead is 3 minutes. It's okay. The foreplay is the thing that we're focusing on here. I am in a honeymoon phase, though, man, in the sense that I have a lot of expectations that I'm placing upon this home gym in terms of what it'll do for me. And so I've had time to think due to there being a lag between me wanting one and me actually getting one. And so it is pretty damn basic. I have, a timeline of what I ultimately want. I'll tell you what I'm getting immediately. This is not what I'm recommending anyone else to get, but there is a rationale behind every single piece that I'm choosing to get. In the first place, I actually decided to go with a squat stand, not the two independent ones, but one that's shaped, like a U, versus a power rack, just in terms of space. So my garage where I'll be lifting, it's about 300 square feet, and so this is a 3x3. I went with this one because then you can have a pull-up attachment on top. You can also have inside. It's about 100 pounds, Eric. So instead of the independent squat stands, because it's 100 pounds, very sturdy, the way it was welded, you can have a dip station put inside. So I have the dip attachment and pull-ups. So I got dips, pull-ups. Now we got the squat stand. I got just a flat bench, and I actually got a plyo box. This is me trying to save a little bit of cash. Where I got the plyo box. So it's like a low incline bench I could make, but it's not an adjustable bench because its bench is sturdy. So the flat bench. And then because I do lean towards barbells, I have so this is where I did splurge, is I do have a power bar. I have a deadlift bar, which indeed I got, because I do find, especially with this elbow, the grip, it feels a lot better, a lot easier. So I did get that. That is a very specialty thing that I don't think anyone needs, but I got because I like it. The Swiss bar is the one I really like. There's I got from the company's called like Bells of Steel, because their one is called the Arch Nemesis bar. So picture a Swiss bar. So that's neutral grip. For those that don't know, it's either called a football bar or a Swiss bar. So neutral grip. So it feels a lot better on this elbow. I've been dealing with this elbow situation. It has been absolutely game changer for me to be able to bench press again. Anyways, it's a neutral grip, but also it's shaped kind of like not quite a buffalo bar, but where it has that angle to it, like maybe they call it a McDonald's bar, where it then has the curves, so it has a larger range of motion. So that I've heard really good things about it. I know Bruce Krabchak, aka Bryce Krawchek, has been using it and said great things. So the bars are the things that I probably splurged the most on, man. Would be those. I did get an easy curl bar because it is time to get yakety yak, do some of the coils, do some of the tricep extensions. I did get 2 adjustable dumbbells. So it's plate loaded dumbbells. So those are and then last one, sorry. I got it mainly for my brother, but why the hell not for myself too? Even though I don't really enjoy them, I got a hex bar. So I got a trap bar. So it's very bar heavy, as you could hear. That's like the majority, man. And then I got a bunch of plates. Eric, I did end up getting iron plates, but then I did get calibrated bumper plates. I did nice. I did the damn thing. And then this, I think that is the vast majority. There's a few, and then what I'm saving up for would be 2 things. One would be a cable stack. So I've seen your cable stack, and I think that's really cool. So it'd be like a double, how do you say, like a 2 pulley, yep. 2 pulley cable
dual
stack.
Pulley.
Dual pulley. And then I'm also probably going to get like an Aerodyne bike or something like that for the winter months, just in order to warm up and so forth, because heating would be an issue. But that's like, those are the essentials. I will add probably a few more things, but I think my plan, Eric, is to train there 90% of the time. So that costs a few grand total. My plan is to train there 80 to 90% of the time, and then things like the leg press and a few other things. So like a leg extension, I would go to Fortis to do. I also want to build, they had a 6x6, a really neat, Eric, belt squat that was like a do-it-yourself. It was a wooden one, so you get the plyo boxes to stand on top of, and then just with the way they have it, it's real simple. It doesn't take up a lot of space, but it functions just like any other high-end belt squat in terms of how you could load it and the tension you feel in the legs and all that fun stuff. So that'd be one other thing besides the cable stack I want to add in the future.
Nice. I mean, that's That's a really good. I mean, I'm let's just say I'm excited next time we're going to train together.
Hell yeah, man. Oh, and then Eric, because of course I can't forget it. So they're $15, but I love them. The push-up handles, and then also I'm gonna get eventually a weighted vest because I'm a big fan. Again, for the elbow, the things that Dr. Sam Spinelli has had me do. So it's like, you know what? I like this movement so much. Let's actually make it a little bit more challenging as opposed to doing 40 repetitions, right? Because in terms of what you said with that study, it's fun. I enjoy it. Can I do 15 instead? Can I make this a little bit more challenging in some way? Yeah.
Can I drop my discomfort and my feeling scale into a more preferable range?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So that's that, man. That is going to be for myself. I'm excited to see. I have a question for you. That's a question from a user.
Yes, sir.
Okay. The TikTokers, it's where the highest quality goes. So Asif2604 said, "Can you take NSAIDs after working out? Does it significantly reduce protein synthesis and ruin gains?" This is the final cherry.
Now, this is a question I got on Instagram, and I did respond.
Yeah.
The nature of Instagram questions is, unfortunately, you can only respond in brief. And I did respond to that. But I figured it was worth diving into a little more because there is a little nuance to this. And the reason is I don't know how old Asif is. I'm assuming that he's a younger gentleman.
2,604. Because that's his username.
There you go. Right. So probably a recent adult, right? Based on whatever year it is, I have no idea. But yeah. So there is a study, and again, I swear I'm not just trying to constantly plug Mass, but we reviewed it in Mass. I reviewed it in Mass back in 2017 by Lila and colleagues. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's Lilja. And its high doses of anti-inflammatory drugs compromise muscle strength and hypertrophic adaptations to resistance training in young adults. So it's specifically on men and women aged 18 to 35. And it was an 8-week study where every day they were taking, I think, 1.2 grams of ibuprofen. And it was compared to a group that was taking painkillers that were not NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Okay. And they found that, yes, indeed, it did have a suppressive effect on outcomes, and probably has to do with the mechanism. So non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs they inhibit COX enzymes, which are responsible for the formation of prostaglandins. Prostaglandins they're hormone-like messengers, and they have a lot of different functions in tissue. And one of their roles is the mediation of inflammation. And inflammation is often a buzzword for bad in the fitness industry. Like, you should eat X thing or do X thing because it reduces inflammation. And inflammation is always bad. But the inflammatory process is part of the healing process. It is also part of skeletal muscle remodeling. And if you inhibit it, it does seem to have negative effects on some of the things that are related to hypertrophy. There are mechanistic studies which suggest that satellite cell signaling can be impeded by taking high doses of NSAIDs, and that this can result in downstream negative effects on muscle protein synthesis. So the basic answer is, yes, you can take them post-workout. Yes, they will. They can negatively impact muscle protein synthesis and other anabolic pathways towards muscle growth. And yes, in young adults, this does seem to be a negative. However, and here's the big one: in case, Asif, you are in your I would say later stages of life, to not unfairly name anyone, to try to be to be PC for old folks, and I do mean actual, like, older people. Like, when we talked about this off camera, you were like, so we're in our late 30s. What does that count? And I'm like barely still in my late 30s. I'm 39. So I'm middle-aged pretty soon, in like 6 months or something like that, or however long it is. I can't even remember how long it is till April. So there you go. But no, there was a study by Trapp and colleagues in 2011 that was on individuals who were between 60 to 85, again, males and females, 12-week study. And they were taking acetaminophen, so that's 4 grams a day, which is not an NSAID, or again, ibuprofen, 1.2 grams a day. And indeed, they specifically found, wait for this one, Omar, greater hypertrophy in the group that was actually taking NSAIDs. So I think this is an indication that suggests that there's probably a sweet spot or a Goldilocks zone for inflammation that is appropriate. And in general, you see higher baseline levels in older individuals of inflammation that may actually be counterproductive to hypertrophy, that if you can bring it back down a little bit, it might be better. And another thing, so again, we see that it is probably relative to your baseline level of inflammation to where an NSAID can have a positive, negative, or probably a neutral impact. Another thing I want to say is that these probably aren't going to be huge effects. Most people don't take 1.2 grams of ibuprofen every day for 8 to 12 weeks, right? The questions that people are actually asking about is, I'm really sore today, or I have a headache. Can I take 600 milligrams or 800 milligrams of ibuprofen today, right? And how often does this happen? Maybe once or twice a week I get these headaches. Like that's like on the higher side of the frequency, I would think. Like, Omar, let me ask you, like, how often do you take painkillers for?
Never.
Are you one of those dudes who just doesn't ever take it? Because I'm also, for no good reason.
Yeah.
Okay, let me ask you a better question. How often do you get headaches or?
Yeah, every several weeks, maybe one.
Okay. And, so for example, my wife gets menstrual cramps where she wants to take it, and that's, for a couple days a month, right? Yep. So if we're talking about someone with a high frequency of headaches who menstruates and has menstrual cramps, now maybe we're talking about taking it 1 to 2 times a week. That is still a quarter to a seventh of the amount of time that has been observed in these studies, and at a higher dose, right? Most people are not taking 1.2 grams. So I would say that in most cases, you just don't need to worry about this. You definitely don't need to worry about it if you're an older individual. If anything, it might help you. I'm not saying take NSAIDs every day. I'm not saying anything about a directive on how much to take. Again, I'm not a real doctor. I'm one of those philosophy doctors. But it's interesting. This is not one of those things that we can boil down to a good, bad, or doesn't matter. It is context specific. And I think it's really important to understand that the times that we do see it have a negative impact, it is a high dose, frequent dose, and for 2 to 3 months at a time versus occasionally taking it. So generally, don't stress it. I'm confident in saying that, yes, if you're a young person and for 8 weeks straight, you took over a gram of ibuprofen every day, it might impede your gains. Don't do that.
Asif with the undetermined age. Hopefully that answers the question.
Absolutely.
I am 90 years old. This took me 3 minutes to type out. Don't appreciate the banter about my age before I apologize then. You know what? We got to get back to the sincere apologies. Well, guess what, Eric? In 60 years, when we're 65, we will be on that path of trying to lower our inflammation. But I feel that if we just...
So we're 5 years old, just to clarify?
Yeah. Solar years. So it depends on what planet we're talking about here, because if we're like, this is Earth, are we going back to where we're originally from? Do we tell the cult where we're originally from?
I mean, I guess it depends on how long our lawyers in Delaware stay alive.
Right.
One thing I actually feel bad about, shout out to Brendan, which is Brandon's eventual grandson, is by stating that we would be alive, but Brandon would be dead. It sounds like we unlocked the keys to immortality, but didn't share them with Brandon, our editor.
Yeah, it's too powerful. Well, there's that definitely.
Sorry, Brandon.
There's that definitely true, totally not even apocryphal, downright false story about. It's one of those things you read on the internet. You're like, hold up. Basically, one of the nuclear physicists, when they're first discovering the atom bomb, there was like this is a terribly not true in the slightest story.
This is false.
Yeah, okay. but there was supposedly so one of the physicists. This is the true part. Said that someone came up to him and said that you're merely discovering whatever atomic bombs. We've known about this for a long period. Be careful. Yada 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 yada. Whether this is true or not, the interaction, who knows? This person wasn't a high-level individual, but basically the person that came up was from a shadowy organization that has ties to alchemy, which is amazing, which is hilarious. So all that to say, Eric, we've divined these ancient, let's say, secrets, and are we protective of them because of their large-scale implications for the rest of humanity? Yes. Therefore, do some sacrifices need to be made, i.e., one of our closest and dearest friends not being privy to the newly found information we discovered? Yes.
Well, I mean, as a representative of the History Channel, I think, you've aligned yourself with the truth seekers who are trying to figure out what
Really
knowledge
get
is
to the
left
bottom
from
of
the
things.
from the ancient aliens, and
Yeah.
what can be safely shared,
Yeah.
or what should be kept to two aristocratic oligarchs on top of a pyramid who can safeguard humanity with their immortality.
Yeah.
I trust you, so I know that we're making the best decision by letting Brandon die.
Eric, final thing I'll say, how amazing is it, how feeble are humans in general, where we can't conceptualize that thousands of years ago there was a level of craftsmanship in these civilizations that allowed these wonders to exist, that by necessity we have to invent the extremely implausible notion that there were intelligent alien life forms that gave the information to all these distinct cultures, that it couldn't be that. Like, basically, when we perceive these cultures from 2020, 2022, and we're like, oh, 3000 BC in Egypt, that's impossible with the stones. Or we look at the amongst Aztecs, like any of the structures, the ziggurats, the Sumerians, they couldn't have done it on their own. I think that's just a fantastic aspect of us, a reflection of modern society. Nothing that happened in the past. I think that's
Bro,
astounding.
We don't even think we could have landed on the moon 60 years ago.
Right.
I mean, like,
it's like, but how did they do it really? It's like, we just explained
they
how
didn't
they
even
did.
have the internet. Yeah.
How is it even possible? Oh man, yeah. No, I think that's a perfect place to leave it. Answering to the final two, particularly the NSAIDs question, is definitely worthy of a conversation. And we got the rocks off, Eric. The hypertrophy. We knew how to title this, and you knew that you had to do the deep dive just to justify us that it wasn't clickbait, because that's the title right there. So if it was only 15 minutes, let's say you blitzed through it, and then for whatever reason I went on this long soliloquy all about what I'm getting in the home gym, and that was like 65 minutes, so it was like 85% of the episode, people would riot.
Well, I'm still trying to regain the people's trust after the death of powerlifting episode. That title, people really thought powerlifting died, and when they found out it didn't, we've been getting hell ever since. So
yeah, it's something. It's like when people discover that Santa Claus isn't real, they discover that it is more allegorical. A lot of our tales, they're told in parables rather than the literal interpretation that powerlifting has in fact died and it's ceased to exist. And that can be difficult for some people. Do we create it as such, like these things that we're saying, so that we have outs in case they turn out to be true? Definitely not. Definitely, that is not the reason why we're not exact with some of the things we say, and it's more, once again, open interpretation. It's more that it's richer that way, I think.
Yeah, I literally think it's allegorical.
Well, I will say, I want to thank everyone for listening to another episode of The Iron Culture. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review. We'll read it from atop our pyramid, the only true pyramid that exists. Typically, people leave 5 stars, but again, you're open. We don't believe in pure determinism. We believe in your free will, okay, that you could go ahead and choose whatever you want to give us, and we will read those rating and reviews in that next episode. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. We'll catch you every single Monday from now until we divine that ancient wisdom of immortality.